Welcome back to another episode of SmoothBrainEDH, where we make the smoothest plays with the biggest brains. Due to some members' busy schedules and some sickness going around, we decided to record some webcam gameplay for you all today. Fair warning though, at least one player, Cameron, had us not so great of a setup, so please don't be too mean to him in the comments. Or do, I'm not his dad. First up is Chandler and Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. This mono-white deck plans to flood the board with creatures and swing in for tons of damage with its commander. His opening hand is a Plains, Urza Saga, Scavenger Grounds, Sword of the Animist, Land Tax, Feldar Retreat, and Cathar Commando. Next up is Matt on Adrix and Nev, Twin Casters. This deck is all about tokens and making tons of them. Matt has filled his deck to the brim with some of the most powerful token generators he could find and plans to use them to crush his opponents. He keeps a hand of Yavimaya Coast, Urza Saga, Balagad Recovery, Arcane Signet, Cryptolith Rite, Tireless Tracker, and Wormcoil Engine. Third is Jason on Breena, the Demagogue. This Orzhov deck plays the political game, incentivizing opponents to swing at each other with the allure of card draw from Breena. All the while, Jason is loading up an Ornithopter with +1/+1 counters from Breena's ability to destroy them. He starts the game with a Swamp, Command Tower, Bajuka Bog, Myriad Landscape, Orzhov Signet, Ornithopter, and Windborne Muse. Last up this game is Cameron on Tanazir Quandrix. This Simic deck plans to play evasive creatures, then use Tanazir's ability to make them chonky lads to knock down enemy life totals. He keeps a snow-covered island, Misty Rainforest, Castle Vantress, 3 visits, Regrowth, Snapcaster Mage, and Chasm Skulker. We're about to hop right into it, but before that, go ahead and leave us a comment on who you hope will take home the victory this game. While you're down there, go ahead and give us a like and subscribe. Also, if you haven't checked it out yet, we started a podcast and uploaded our first episode earlier this week. Link to that video and all of our social media will be in the description, along with the deck lists. Now, on to the gameplay.
It looks like Chandler wins the die roll, and he starts off with a turn 1 Urza Saga, and then passes the turn to Matt, who does the exact same thing. Jason will play a Myriad Landscape, and then cast a free Ornithopter before passing the turn to Cameron. Cameron plays and fetches with a Misty Rainforest. He finds a Rimewood Falls tapped to the battlefield, and then passes the turn to Chandler. Chandler plays a Plains, and then casts his Sword of the Animist, and then passes the turn to Matt. Matt plays a Yavimaya Coast, taps for 2, and casts Arcane Signet before passing to Jason. Jason will play Command Tower as land for turn, and then cast an Orzhov Signet. After this, he moves to combat and swings for 0 at Matt. The turn is then passed to Cameron, who plays a Castle Vantress as land for turn, then taps for 2 to cast 3 visits. He'll find an untapped Snow Forest to the battlefield, and he'll pass to Chandler while he's searching. After Chandler's draw step, he'll float a colorless, and then sacrifice his Urza Saga to go find a Soul Ring to the battlefield. He'll then play a Plains, and then tap for 1 more to cast his Cathar Commando. He then taps his Soul Ring to equip Sword of the Animist, and then taps for 1 more to cast Paladin class. The turn will then be passed to Matt, and he will do the exact same thing with Urza Saga, tap for a mana, and then search for Soul Ring. After this, he'll cast Adrix and Nev, and take a damage to his Yavimaya Coast. After this, Balagad Sanctuary is played tapped as land for turn. He'll then pass the turn to Jason, who casts Breena and then moves to combat, swinging Ornithopter at Chandler, drawing a card and putting 2 1/1 counters on it. He then plays a Bajuka Bog as land for turn, and after a little bit of thinking, he decides to bog Matt's Urza Saga. After this, the turn is passed to Cameron, and Cameron starts off with a basic island and then plays Snapcaster Mage. He targets and flashes back 3 visits with it to find a basic forest untapped to the battlefield. The turn will then be passed to Chandler, and Chandler starts off with a Feldar Retreat. He'll then play a Scavenger Grounds as land for turn, Landfall will trigger, and he'll make a 2/2 White Cat. After this, he'll move to combat and swing Cathar Commando at Matt. Jason will put 2 counters on Breena, Chandler will get to draw a card, and then Chandler also gets to search for a basic Plains to the battlefield tapped. When he does, he'll make another 2/2. The turn will then be passed to Matt, and he starts off with a Tireless Tracker. He'll then play a Path to Ancestry as land for turn, and when it enters, he'll make 2 Clue tokens. Then, after some thinking, he passes the turn to Jason. And Jason will once again move straight to combat. He'll swing Ornithopter at Cameron and Breena at Chandler. He'll get 2 Breena triggers since they are both at higher life totals than Matt. He'll put 2 more counters on Ornithopter and 2 more on Breena. Cameron will take 4 damage and Chandler will take 5 Commander. And Jason also gets 2 cards. After this, he'll cast Oreskos Explorer. His Signet is hiding under his Myriad Landscape, so he only has 3 lands. So when it enters, he gets to find 2 Plains to his hand. He'll then play one of these Plains as land for turn. Then tap for 2 and cast Knight of the White Orchid. Cameron still has more lands than him, so he searches for a Plains to the battlefield. That Plains just so happens to be a Godless Shrine, and he chooses to not shock it in. The turn is then passed to Cameron, who plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn. After this, he decides to cast his commander, Tanazir Quandrix. He'll pass the turn to Chandler after this. Chandler decides to move to combat again and swing 4 more at Matt. Breena will trigger, Chandler draws a card, and Jason puts 2 counters on his Knight of the White Orchid, and Chandler also gets to find a tapped plains to the battlefield. And he'll also get another 2/2. After this, he'll cast a Felwar Stone into a Recruiter of the Guard. Wanting to potentially get some more card draw, he finds and casts an Esper Sentinel. And finally, with his last mana, he casts a land tax. Chandler will then go to pass his turn, but Matt stops him on his end step to crack a clue. Matt will then tap for 6 mana and cast a Rampaging Baloths. He'll then play a basic forest and make 2 clues and 2 beasts. The turn will then be passed to Jason. He'll do the exact same thing as he did last turn, move to combat and swing Ornithopter at Cameron and Breena at Chandler. He'll put the counters in the same places and draw 2 cards. He'll then play a Temple of the False God as land for turn. After this, he casts Victory Chimes and does pay the 1. He'll then cast Lightning Greaves and equip them to Breena immediately. And finally, scared of the Rampaging Baloth, Jason vindicates it. After this, he'll pass the turn to Cameron, and Cameron starts off with a Yavimaya. He then taps for 7 mana and casts Old Gnawbone. He then moves to combat and knows he wants to swing Tanazir at Jason, but doesn't see any good swings for a Snapcaster Mage. Chandler, who is afraid of dying to command damage next turn, offers to let the Snapcaster through in exchange for a small favor to potentially keep him alive in the future. Cameron accepts the deal and swings Tanazir at Jason and his Snapcaster Mage at Chandler. And when Tanazir attacks, it makes Snapcaster Mage a base 4/4. Chandler and Jason both take 4, and Cameron makes 8 treasure tokens. After this, he casts Chasm Skulker, and then just passes the turn to Chandler. On Chandler's upkeep, land tax will trigger because Cameron has more lands than him, so he'll tutor 3 planes to his hand. He'll then play one of the planes as land for turn, and Felidar Retreat will trigger. This time, he decides to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls. After this, he'll cast an Eldrazi Monument. This makes the table kinda scared. After this, he goes to combat and declares his 3 cats and Cathar Commando at Jason. Upon attacking, Sword of the Animus triggers again, and he gets another planes. Felidar Retreat will trigger again, and he puts more counters on his creatures. With all these flying attackers, Jason really can't do anything about it, so he takes 22 damage. Post-combat, Chandler casts Basri Ket and upticks him on Esper Sentinel, trying to make sure people can't pay that tax. The turn will then be passed to Matt, who plays an Exotic Orchard and makes 2 clue tokens. He then taps for 7 mana and casts Hornet Queen. When it enters, he makes 8 1/1 insects with Death Touch. Matt will then move to combat and swing 2 4/4s at Cameron. Breena will trigger, and Jason will put 2 counters on his Explorer. Matt will draw a card, and Cameron will block one of them with Gnawbone, still taking 4 damage. Then after this, the turn is passed to Jason. And Jason drops a Rogue's Passage. Chandler knows that this is the end for him, and asks Cameron if he can do anything to help him. Cameron unfortunately only has a counter, so Rogue's Passage was the perfect answer. Jason moves Greaves over to his Ornithopter, and Chandler decides to respond. Knowing that he's dead anyway, Chandler taps a mana and sacrifices Cathar Commando to blow up the Ornithopter in response to the equip trigger. The Greaves are then moved over to the Knight, Breena is given unblockable, and then the Greaves are moved back. He then moves to combat, and he'll swing his Knight of the White Orchid at Matt, and then Breena at Chandler. He gets 1 trigger off of this, and he puts the 2 counters on Breena, and draws a card. Moving on to damage, Matt will take 4 damage, and Chandler unfortunately dies to commander damage. Chandler also peeks at the top card of his library, and it was a Path to Exile, exactly what he needed to get out of this situation. Moving on, Jason casts a Ghostly Prison, trying to stabilize. Next, he casts a Together Forever, which is very good in his deck. Cameron decides that's a little too much, so he Stubborn Denials it. Jason will then pass the turn to Cameron, and Chasm Skulker will get a counter on his draw step. He'll then move to combat and swing with Old Gnawbone, paying for Ghostly Prison with 2 treasures. Gnawbone connects, and Cameron gets 7 more. He'll then just pass the turn to Matt, and Matt will start his turn off with a Cryptolith Rite, and then taps for 8 mana to cast a Nasty Terasti. Ultimately, he decides to just blow up Ghostly Prison, and Jason will get a 3/3. Matt will then move to combat and swing 6 of his 1/1s and Hornet Queen herself at Jason. Unfortunately for him, this knocks him out of the game. But before damage, he gives Cameron a mana with Victory Chimes. Matt will then attempt to pass the turn, but Cameron will stop him on his end step and activate Castle Vantress, scrying 2 to the bottom. On his upkeep, he will repeat the process, scrying both to the bottom yet again. When he draws a card, Chasm Skulker will get another counter. He'll then move to combat and swing Tanazir at Matt, making 4 more treasure tokens when it connects. Cameron will then pass the turn, and Matt cracks a clue token by tapping 2 creatures on his end step. He forgets to put a counter on his Tireless Tracker, but he will realize it later in his turn. He plays a Mossword Bridge as land for turn, and hides away 1 card. He'll get 2 more clue tokens from this as well. Matt decides to go big or go home, and drops an Azuri's Predation. Unfortunately for him, Cameron has a negate. Matt will then move to combat, and swing his 4/4 and Terastodon at Cameron. Onto blocks, Cameron puts Gnawbone in front of the 4/4 and his Chasm Skulker in front of Terastodon. When Chasm Skulker dies, Cameron makes 2 Squid tokens. And after combat, Matt decides to pass the turn back to Cameron. On Cameron's upkeep, he'll sacrifice 4 treasures again to activate Castle Vantress to scry 2 to the bottom yet again. Now in his main phase, Cameron will cast Regrowth to get Stubborn Denial back to his hand. Cameron will then attempt to pass the turn, but Matt stops him on his end step, taps 10 creatures for 10 mana, and sacrifices 5 clue tokens to draw 5 cards. And Tireless Tracker gets 5 more +1/+1 counters. Now in his main phase, Matt tries to bait out the Stubborn Denial by casting Rapid Hybrid, targeting Gnawbone. Cameron lets it go through, Gnawbone dies, and Cameron gets a 3/3. He then plays Field of the Dead as land for turn, but forgets to make the 2 zombies. He does, however, get the 2 clue tokens. After this, he casts an Essex Fractal Bloom, then a Tendershoot Dryad. And as it turns out, Essex and Tendies are very good together. Matt will then move to combat and swing his Hornet Queen at Cameron for 2. Matt will then attempt to pass the turn, but Cameron is not a big fan of his board state, so he sacrifices all of his treasures, then taps for 3 more to overload a Cyclonic Rift. Matt decides to respond by tapping 2 creatures and cracking a clue. He repeats this process 2 more times, but unfortunately does not find a way to protect his board, so the Sea Rift will resolve. Matt then has to move to discard, and he discards a lot of cards, so I'm just going to let him say it for you.
Makes
I
sense.
discard a Kodama's Reach, a Seagate Restoration, an Eldrazi Monument, a Wormcoil Engine, a Toadski Barrier of Secrets, a Simic Signet, an Essex Fractal Bloom, a Tendershoot Dryad, a Tireless Tracker, and a Terastodon.
The turn is then passed to Cameron. Cameron then top decks the Win, which is a Return of the Wild Speaker. When he casts it, he'll give all non-humans +3/+3. This makes Tanazir Quandrix a 7/7, so when he attacks, all other creatures will become 7/7s. That is more than enough to kill Matt, who has an empty board and is tapped out. So congratulations to Cameron and Tanazir Quandrix for this week's win. Well, there you have it, everyone. Of course the person with the cursed setup wins. Why not? I will say though, that was a great showing for everyone. Jason had a lot of political power during that game, and it caused everybody to swing at each other and make his creatures get massive. And Chandler, even though he never cast Adeline, didn't really need to. He amassed a huge board of white weenies and was very threatening. Matt was able to drop bomb after bomb, but unfortunately, Cyclonic Rift beats all. And that allowed Cameron to buff up his board and sneak in the win. I really enjoyed this game, so let us know what you thought in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to check out the deck lists and visit our social media pages. And between you and me, keep an eye out for an upcoming public Discord and potential live streams in the future. As always, you guys, thank you so much for watching. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we love reading your comments when you leave them. But as always, you guys, have a smooth day.